Brackeys Game Jam number 6. Took place from August 22nd to the 29th, and I participated in it. This was one of the largest game jams I participated in, with over 10,000 participants and over 1,700 entries. I had an absolute blast in the last Brackeys Game Jam, and there's a link in the description to a devlog detailing my previous process. I thought I might as well participate in this jam also, since it's held by Brackeys once again. For those of you who don't know, Brackeys is a channel dedicated to inspiring newer game designers to create. They host a bunch of really useful tutorials, especially if you use Unity. If you are a complete beginner to game design, I highly recommend you go check them out. Before diving into the game, let's talk about something quite important, the theme. A while back, there was actually a poll open with a bunch of potential themes for this jam. This included Conductor, Into the Mystic, Let There Be Chaos, Nothing to Lose, One Wasn't Enough, 1 2 question mark, Saved by the Bell, Vintage, Vulnerable by Design, and finally, What Goes Around Comes Around. As you can see, there were quite a few themes on this list. Of course, since it was a poll, I had to choose some of the themes I liked. These ones ended up being Let There Be Chaos, Nothing to Lose, Vintage, Vulnerable by Design, and What Goes Around Comes Around. I personally like these themes the most, and would be happy if any of them were to be chosen. They were all very open-ended, which I felt was a necessity for a game jam theme. The other themes I felt were either way too specific, or I thought they were just a bit off to me. They weren't bad by any means, it's just I preferred these themes in comparison to the other ones. With my votes casted, I eagerly awaited the announcement of the actual theme in the Discord, and it was decided that it would be Let There Be Chaos. This was fantastic. It was one of the themes I voted for, and one I thought had a lot of potential for interpretation. Besides the theme, games are going to be rated in the following 6 categories: game design, fun, innovation, theme, graphics, and audio. With all that out of the way, let's jump right into making a game for the 6th Brackeys Game Jam. Alright, so with the theme decided, I started brainstorming ideas. To help with this, I messaged David, who some of you might remember as the person who helped me a lot with my previous Brackeys Game Jam entry. While David was too busy to help with the actual game design process this time, he still helped me nail down what type of game I should do. When I first messaged him the theme Let There Be Chaos, David quickly came up with 2 genres that we could use. First one is bullet hell, as it quite literally is chaotic and hectic. However, I've done a few other bullet hell games on this channel, so I kept it as a possible option, but I wanted to do something different. That's when David mentioned slingshot games. Let me elaborate on this, as there's one particular game we were discussing. In New Super Mario Bros. DS and Mario 64 DS, there are these fantastically creative and fun minigames. One of them is called Bob-omb Squad. In it, you slingshot cannonballs to defend your 4 flowers from bob-ombs coming from the sky. Both David and I agreed that this game could get really chaotic as you're trying to make sure that the 4 flowers don't die. We thought that this was a good starting place for designing a chaotic game. After all of this, David messaged me with a rough mock-up of a potential game. He mentioned specifically, enemies raid from above, and you shoot elemental knights at them. Then, they fight for a few seconds before coming back. I thought this was an interesting take, but I ultimately didn't do it as I wanted the game to feel more fast-paced. I feel that if they were to fight for a few seconds, it might feel a bit clunky. However, I really like the idea of the characters being elemental knights, and this is where I made a proper design document, so let's go over that. While it isn't too detailed, I figure I should still cover what I noted down. First, I came up with a title early on being Knights of Chaos. It's such a simple title, but I really liked it. Next, I came up with the main mechanic relating to the elemental knights. The player would essentially pick one at a time and be granted their elemental powers. Fire shots would be powerful and cause explosions, ice shots would shatter into smaller pieces causing more damage, electric shots would rapidly fire out and pierce enemies, and psychic attacks would cover a large area but be somewhat slower. I also decided each knight should have an individual mana bar, forcing players to switch powers as the other knight would be recharging. Also, all knights I decided would be a one-hit KO type situation to make the game a bit harder and more chaotic. With that decided, here's a rough mock-up sketch I did. Essentially, the player would be in the middle, and both on the left and right side would be the elemental knights. When you select a knight, a colored line would appear between the player and the knight, signifying which element you are using. And with that, I had a solid enough plan for a game to make, so I began actually making the game. moving on to actually making the game, let's discuss how it actually happened. The first thing I did was create the player and the night objects. Alongside this, I created the linkage objects. Here's what the first build looked like. Originally, the player was going to move, which is why I spent some time creating a way for the linkages to be resized based on where the player was. Next up, I created the mana system. The way it works is so that you can only select a knight once it has a full bar of mana. This makes it so the player has two options really. If the player wants to main a knight, they can, but they have to wait to use them, and that leaves them vulnerable. The second option is just to pick another knight. The mana mechanic essentially forces the player to choose another knight to use, which is exactly what I wanted. After this, I decided it was time to work on some art for the game. I wanted this game to feel a bit more retro, so I went with a simple pixel art style. Before this though, I had to pick out a palette to work with. To do so, I used this fantastic website known as LostSpec. LostSpec is a website that hosts a bunch of really good color palettes and resources. For my game, I went with a palette known as Pair 36. With the palette selected, I worked on creating some sprites. The first sprites I created were of the Elemental Knights. I went for a sort of chibi-like design with them, and I think they turned out really great. Next up, I created some art for the background and floor. I went for an outdoor castle aesthetic. I also created some stairs where the player would be standing on. Here's what that looks like in-game. As you can see, the player was just an orange square, as I had no idea what it would be at the time. I originally designed a fifth knight, which would be the player, but I wasn't really feeling it. Then it came to me. The player should be an orb. Let me explain. I was for some reason thinking of SpongeBob, and in one of the episodes, there's this Orb of Confusion, which has the power to confuse people. I decided the player should be the Orb of Chaos. The orb would be powered up with the powers of the knights, allowing it to shoot in any direction. I thought that this was a sick idea. With that decided, I modified the staircase to have an area to house the orb, and created different colored animations for each elemental knight. After this, I worked on the main shooting mechanic, and here's what that looked like. Next up, I worked on the rest of the sprites for the game. This includes the basic enemies, a bomb, the elemental attacks, some clouds, and the final boss. I decided the enemies would be known as Ali-Skulls, merging the words alien and skull together. It's really cheesy, but it works. After this, I worked on creating these actual enemies in the game. The basic enemy would come in from either side of the screen and occasionally drop a bomb. If a bomb hits a knight, they're dead and out for good. The boss I decided would essentially be the same as the basic enemies, except it would drop a larger bomb that could cover more area. Essentially, this keeps the game relatively simple. With all these sprites done, here's what that looked like in-game. I thought the game was looking pretty much complete, so I went ahead and designed a few more screens with some transitions. First up, I made the title screen. Nothing too complex here. Then I made a how to play screen explaining the game's controls and a basic plot. With those screens created, the game was complete, so I decided to begin prepping the game's itch.io page. For this game, I really wanted it to be playable in a browser like how I usually do it, but unfortunately the browser build of this game is quite buggy. For some reason, clicking on a knight is buggy, and in general, it doesn't play as well in a browser as on a desktop, so I included both builds on the itch.io page. However, I decided to add a little bonus to the desktop version, Discord Rich Presence. You know how some games have the ability to integrate with Discord? I decided to add that to the Knights of Chaos. Here's what that looks like. It may just be a tiny addition, but I think it adds a bit more professionalism to the game, as it shows you exactly what you're playing, alongside a little description of where you are in the game. After all of this, I submitted the page to the jam and called it there. I was quite happy with this game, as during the week I was quite busy, but I managed to get out a simple and fun game. If you have any interest, go check out the game page and download it. If you happen to be watching this video within the first 2 or so weeks, and you submitted a jam entry, go check out the game and leave it a rating. If you didn't submit an entry, don't worry. Leave a comment if you want to give some feedback. Any feedback or ratings are really appreciated, as I want to constantly keep improving my games and my content. If you enjoyed this video as well, be sure to give it a like, and subscribe if you haven't. I'll definitely be making more devlogs like these in the future, so stick around if you're into that. As always, thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.